The flexor muscles of the forearm are in the anterior compartment of the forearm and are separated from the extensor muscles of the forearm by the radius and ulna, and in the distal two-thirds of the forearm by the interosseous membrane that connects them. The tendons of most flexor muscles are located on the anterior surface of the wrist and are held in place by the palmar carpal ligament and the flexor retinaculum. The flexor muscles are arranged in 3 layers or groups. A superficial layer or group of 4 muscles includes the pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi ulnaris. These muscles are all attached proximally by a common flexor tendon to the medial epicondyle of the humerus, the common flexor attachment. An intermediate layer consisting of 1 muscle, which is the flexor digitorum superficialis, and a deep layer or group of 3 muscles, which includes the flexor digitorum profundus, flexor pollicis longus, and pronator quadratus. The pronator teres is the most lateral of the superficial forearm flexors. Its lateral border forms the medial boundary of the cubital fossa. It has 2 heads. The humeral head arises from the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and the ulnar head arises from the medial border of the carotenoid process of the ulna. The muscle inserts to the lateral aspect of shaft of radius here. Median nerve supplies this muscle, and it passes actually between 2 heads of the pronator teres. The function of the muscle is the pronation and flexion of forearm, from here the name, the pronator teres. The flexor carpi radialis is a long fusiform muscle located medial to the pronator teres. Here it is. Its proximal insertion is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and the distal insertion is the basis of 2nd and 3rd metacarpal bones. In the midline of the forearm, its fleshy belly is replaced by a long flattened tendon that becomes cord-like as it approaches the wrist. To reach its distal attachment, the flexor carpi radialis tendon passes a canal in the lateral part of the flexor retinaculum and through a vertical groove in the trapezius in its own synovial tendinous sheet of the flexor carpi radialis. The flexor carpi radialis tendon is a good guide to the radial artery, which lies just lateral to it. The flexor carpi radialis produces flexion, then acting with the flexor carpi ulnaris, and abduction of the wrist, then acting with the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis. When acting along, flexor carpi radialis produces a combination of flexion and abduction simultaneously at the wrist, so that the hand moves anterolaterally. The palmaris longus is a small fusiform muscle. It is absent on one or both sides in approximately 14% of people, but its action are not missed. It has a short belly and a long cord-like tendon that passes superficial to the flexor retinaculum and attaches to it and the apex of palmar aponeurosis. The palmaris longus tendon is a useful guide for the median nerve at the wrist. The tendon lies deep and slightly medial to this nerve before it passes deep to the flexor retinaculum. It also participates in flexion of the hand. The flexor carpi ulnaris is the most medial of the superficial flexor muscles. It has double proximal insertion, one on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and another on the medial aspect of the olecranon process and posterior border of the ulna here. And it inserts to the pisiform bone, hook of the hamate base at 5th metacarpal bones. The flexor carpi ulnaris flexes and adducts the hand at the wrist if acting along. It flexes the wrist, then it acts with the flexor carpi radialis and adducts it when acting with the extensor carpi ulnaris. The ulnar nerve enters the forearm by passing between the humeral and ulnar heads of its proximal attachment. This muscle is exceptional among muscles of the anterior compartment, being fully innervated by the ulnar nerve. The tendon of flexor carpi ulnaris is a guide to the ulnar nerve and artery, which are on its lateral side at the wrist. The flexor digitorum superficialis is the largest superficial muscle in the forearm. It has two heads. The humero-ulnar head rises from the medial epicondyle of humerus and medial border of carotid process of ulna. And radial head, each starts from the oblique line on the anterior surface of shaft of radius here. And muscle splits into four tendons. Each one inserts to the medial phalanx of the medial four fingers here. Flexor digitorum superficialis actually forms an intermediate layer between the superficial and deep groups of forearm muscles. The median nerve and ulnar artery enter the forearm by passing between its humero-ulnar and radial heads. Near the wrist, the flexor digitorum superficialis gives rise to four tendons, which pass deep to the flexor retinaculum through the carpal tunnel to the fingers. The four tendons are enclosed in a synovial common flexor sheath. The flexor digitorum superficialis flexes the middle phalanges of the medial four fingers at the proximal interphalangeal joints. Also, it flexes the proximal phalanges at the metacarpophalangeal joints and the wrist. The flexor digitorum superficialis is capable of flexing each finger separately. The flexor digitorum profundus is the only muscle that can flex the distal interphalangeal joints of the fingers. This muscle encloses the anterior aspect of the ulna and rises from the anteromedial surface of shaft of ulna. The flexor digitorum profundum divides into four parts, which end in four tendons that pass posterior to the flexor digitorum superficialis tendons under the flexor retinaculum within the common flexor sheath. Each tendon enters the fibrous sheath of its digit posterior to the flexor digitorum superficialis tendon. The flexor digitorum profundus flexes the distal phalanges, being inserted to the distal phalanges of the medial four fingers. Each tendon is capable of flexing two interphalangeal joints, the metacarpophalangeal joint and the wrist joint. The flexor pollicis longus is long flexor of the thumb, lies lateral to the flexor digitorum profundus. Its proximal insertion is on the anterior surface of shaft of radius, and the distal insertion is the distal phalanx of thumb. This muscle actually covers the anterior aspect of the radius distal to the attachment of the supinator. The flat flexor pollicis longus tendon passes deep to the flexor retinaculum, enveloped in its own synovial tendinal sheath of the flexor pollicis longus on the lateral side of the common flexor sheath. The flexor pollicis longus is the only muscle that flexes the interphalangeal joint of the thumb. It also may assist in flexion of the wrist joint. The pronator quadratus, as its name indicates, is quadrangular and pronates the forearm. It cannot be palpated or observed except in dissections, because it is the deepest muscle in the anterior aspect of the forearm. It arises from the anterior surface of shaft of ulna and inserts to the anterior surface of shaft of radius. The pronator quadratus initiates pronation. It is assisted by the pronator teres when more speed and power are needed. The pronator quadratus also helps the interosseous membrane hold the radius and ulna together, particularly when upward thrusts are transmitted through the wrist, for example during a fall on the hand.